Let's go live on Skype. We have Desmond Walton. He's the Senior Director for Southeast Asia Defense and Security for Bauer Group Asia. Bauer Group Asia is a think tank that's focused on Asia and specifically on Southeast Asia. He's got tremendous experience in our part of the world. And I think one of the things we want to figure out is, why is this important to the Philippines? Why is this important to Southeast Asia? Welcome, Desmond.
Thank you, Maria. It's good to join you.
It's good to have you with us. Let's talk about, what is this new president that will be coming in? What are the key security issues that this person's going to have to deal with?
Well, they're much like the issues that are facing President Obama today. I mean, nothing is going to change tomorrow when we have a president-elect Clinton or a president-elect Trump. Russia, Iran, continuing instability in the Middle East, nuclear issues on the Korean Peninsula, our critical relationship with China, all of those things are going to dominate the foreign policy agenda of whomever becomes our president tomorrow.
You worked at the White House from 2009 to 2011, and you were heading Southeast Asia's National Security Council. And when you were there at that time, tell us a little bit about what it was like. How did the U.S. look at Southeast Asia?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the difference between then and now is, of course, President Obama was elected on an agenda of change. Basically, the country was weary of 8 years of Middle Eastern conflict under President Bush. And so really foreign policy issues, namely the wars, were a key matter for the American electorate to consider back in 2008. So indeed, when President Obama was elected, he quickly made good on his promise to shift focus in American foreign policy, and thus was born the Asia rebalance. So if you contrast that with what we've seen unfolding over the last 18 months of our election season, foreign policy issues have been notably absent. I mean, sure, there have been small things, well, not so small things. Trade has probably been the biggest international issue in the campaign this year, immigration, and then basically just some kind of schoolyard back and forth criticisms over whether it was right to make a deal with Iran or what have you. So really, there's no impetus this year for either candidate to undertake bold foreign policy initiatives a la the rebalance in 2008. So, I was lucky enough to be part of the White House staff in charge of our coordinating our Southeast Asia policy in the early years of the Obama administration. And there was a palpable sense of energy and enthusiasm that we were embarking on something new and very important. I'm afraid that the people that are holding those positions, in 2017 will probably have less emphasis from the Oval Office on Asia in general. Southeast Asia, for sure, will probably have a bit less emphasis. And, that's not all a bad thing. I think there is some danger in, the United States becoming overly infatuated with Asia and perhaps allowing, if our interests in terms of business and security and political relationships are front and center, well, that's one thing. But if values pertaining to countries' internal matters, politics, and their internal issues, if there's an overabundance of American attention, it's very likely that we'll begin to pay attention to those internal issues, which, as we've seen lately in your country, certainly has some downside potential.
Well, that's an interesting. Let's talk about the change that has happened. I mean, the story that America is going through right now is very familiar to the Philippines. A candidate who has great experience in politics, representing old politics to a degree, right? And then a man who's coming in representing change. We've lived through this earlier this year, and we now have a president who has been unpredictable, right? And I'm curious to see, you said that that there could be less emphasis on Asia, but yet at the same time, we're seeing the Philippines pivot away from the United States to China. How much is this, I guess, what is the mood in Washington right now towards the Philippines and this time of change here? And how do you see the U.S. responding to it?
Yeah, great question. You know, among Asia watchers, there is kind of a morbid curiosity in seeing a President Duterte and a President Trump, you know, at the next ASEAN summit, just to see how that volatile mixture would play out on television.
That's not funny.
But beyond that, you know, I think the veteran diplomats in the Obama administration now have taken the correct approach to the Philippines, which is to simply absorb some of President Duterte's rhetoric, not overreact, and instead wait to see what concrete actions he takes. And make no mistake, people are not happy with some of President Duterte's rhetoric, but at the same time, we're not, I think, reacting with great emotion in Washington. Over time, I think, you know, again, we'll just watch what the policy outcomes are. And notably, on the security side, Washington watched with great interest the cabinet meeting that occurred in Manila, I think yesterday, your time. And that, you know, President Duterte could very well have ordered a severance of our security relationship or some very dramatic curtailment thereof. And instead, you know, there were some marginal steps announced, but the big takeaway was that, you know, Minister of Defense Lorenzana, I think his viewpoint prevailed, which is that, hey, this relationship's very critical to both countries. Let's not just flush it down the toilet, so to speak. Let's instead maintain it because it is important for both countries. So that was a very encouraging sign here in Washington. And I think, you know, the mood of the day is patience and not to overreact.
That's great. Let me ask you about a win, a Donald Trump win versus a Hillary Clinton win, and what impact do you think, how would they treat Southeast Asia? So let's talk about Hillary Clinton first. I mean, she's more familiar to us. Her win, if she wins, what would that mean for Southeast Asia?
Well, it should have, under different circumstances, been a great bonanza for Southeast Asia because she was the champion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement. And that, after all, is really what Southeast Asians care most about. They want deepened economic ties, they want more prosperity, and trade is the pathway to achieving those goals. However, the domestic politics here more or less forced Secretary Clinton to kind of abandon the TPP. So regrettably, if she does indeed succeed in becoming our next president, her keystone issue will no longer be on the agenda. I do think due to her time as Secretary of State, where she was very present in Southeast Asia, always showing up at the ministerial meetings that ASEAN held and conducting bilateral visits to every country in ASEAN, spearheading our rapprochement with Myanmar. I mean, she clearly cares about Southeast Asia, and I'm sure she would follow through on some of those initiatives as president. You know, it remains to be seen whether, you know, values, democracy, human rights, and those things that are really important to many Americans, but are sometimes minimized in the foreign policy realm, you know, whether under President Clinton, those would rise to issues of prominence. And if they do, frankly, there's trouble ahead for our relationship with the Philippines, with Thailand, with Malaysia, and other Southeast Asian countries. So that's an interesting thing to watch going forward. Shall we switch to Trump?
Let me ask you a follow. Well, yes, go ahead. Let's go to Trump, and then I'll do a follow-up with you on that. So what would President Trump mean for Southeast Asia? Well,
this will be a blow, and as someone who really, you know, I traveled with President Obama on his first trip to APEC in 2009 in Singapore, and that was only the beginning of his very deep commitment to engaging in the East Asia Summit and traveling in the region. I'm afraid that President Trump will simply not prioritize that type of engagement. His advisors will be people like me and others who will argue strongly that he has to make time on his schedule to show up and do those sorts of things. But I have a feeling that will be a very hard argument to win in the Oval Office with President Trump. So overall, probably less engagement with ASEAN. I think his position on trade is well known. He is very much a skeptic of our international trade agreements. He's spoken out strongly against TPP. So there's really no hope of that sort of agreement being resurrected under President Trump. And again, the question about interests, I think, is the same with President Clinton. You know, as the foreign policy teams on both sides sort themselves out, you know, will there be a strong voice within a Trump administration arguing strongly that values-based diplomacy needs to be an important piece of Trump's foreign policy? And if it is, you know, we have the same pitfalls in front of us.
Correct. But it seems like with both candidates, at least, that the values-based one seems clearer in terms of Hillary Clinton. Let me ask you about something that's happened in the Philippines since July 1. The war on drugs, President Duterte's war on drugs, has taken the lives of more than 4,700 people. It's been a cause of concern for the United States. How do you think both presidents, if both of them would react to something like this, and what would we expect?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge issue back in Washington. And there's no easy way to resolve that. President Duterte seems committed to pursuing his policy, and Washington is getting more and more outspoken about their opposition to that policy. One thing that's worth noting to the listeners tonight is that really the president only has perhaps 50% discretion in foreign policy matters. In things like this, it's the role of the U.S. Congress that's really important. And in fact, in response to the EJK issue in the Philippines, we all read in the paper that Senator Cardin from Maryland blocked the sale of some 25,000 rifles to the Philippine National Police. So those are the types of things that a activist Congress can assert themselves in, and they are very impactful in our bilateral relationships.
In terms of future security issues that you can see, I mean, again, Southeast Asia is quite dynamic now, and what's a little bit worrying about what you said is that it seems like in either way, whether it's a Hillary Clinton presidency or a Donald Trump presidency, that the focus may shift away from Southeast Asia right now. Is this correct, even with a renewed interest by China or a seeming shift to China by both the Philippines and Malaysia? Today, for example, President Duterte is on his way to Malaysia. Malaysia's prime minister has gone to China, and we're seeing the shift. Is this of concern to the U.S.?
Well, it should be. And if you look at the recent history of what Southeast Asian leaders are doing, which I think is directly in response to concern about the sustainability of Washington's engagement in the region, your president, Prime Minister Najib, the Thai government are all hedging against declining American influence in Southeast Asia, and in response, they're doing what is, rational. They're reaching out to their powerful neighbor to the north and trying to repair and strengthen relations with China.
That's so. Yeah, go ahead.
So you're, the 1/3 of ASEAN has already kind of voted with their feet, if you will, and started beating a path north to Beijing. And I think that's a clear indicator that there's deep concern in the region about precisely what you just mentioned, which is whether a President Trump or President Clinton is going to pay much attention to Southeast Asia in the next 4 years.
That actually sounds more worrisome because, of course, the U.S., one of the issues you haven't mentioned is Syria and all of the ISIS that is coming out of there. The Philippines, Southeast Asia also has had its own problems with ISIS. Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim population. Malaysia has had fighters going to Syria and Iraq. What future threats do you think would take the attention of a U.S. president?
Well, it's, the South China Sea and the potential for conflict there will remain the most important flashpoint in Southeast Asia going forward. And that's just such a complex issue, and it's so hard to kind of handicap, what the risk is going forward. But nonetheless, it's an issue that's not going away and certainly does have the potential to spark a conflict in the region. But I think, the issue that you just raised, notably, Islamic extremism and those radicalized jihadist fighters who will be returning from Iraq and Syria as ISIS is dispersed there, that will certainly be something that the region is going to have to grapple with. And the key to combating that, frankly, is just very airtight cooperation between the intelligence and law enforcement and military leaders of the entire region. That's a tough thing to achieve.
Yeah.
It's easy to kind of say, hey, all we need is really good cooperation, but in practice, it is difficult to achieve. And I just hope that the Southeast Asian authorities are preparing for that challenge and are laying in the groundwork for effective cooperation.
You've spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, and your last posting was in Thailand. You've seen the dynamic change that this region is going through. What did you see here that you believe Washington should pay attention to but hasn't made it to their radar screen? What things should we be looking out for?
Yeah, well, look, ASEAN, for a variety of reasons, is an absolutely essential part of the world that the United States needs to be paying attention to. So there are security issues for sure, and we've already talked about those. Economically, some of the most vibrant countries in the world are in Southeast Asia. Therefore, there are great opportunities for growth for American firms. And, you have to be in a position to take advantage of those opportunities. And that means being present, having good political relationships, and not letting those opportunities slip by. So economics are huge. And then on the political side, ASEAN continues to make advancements in terms of its integration, in terms of being treated like a unified bloc a la the EU. Look, it's far from the EU, but, 10 years ago when you spoke of ASEAN, most people would shrug and just kind of yawn and go to the next issue. But now that has changed a lot, and that's taken a lot of hard work by some very skilled diplomats in Southeast Asia. They should be applauded for their achievements. And now ASEAN, as a unified political force, needs to be treated as a serious partner in the region.
I certainly hope that the next president pays attention to it in the same way you have, Des. Let's talk about Barack Obama. I mean, I have two last questions, really. Barack Obama, he's about to step down, and he's done a lot in the last 6 years. You've worked for him from 2009 to 2011. How would you gauge what legacy will this man leave, America's first African-American president?
Yeah, it's hard to really capture legacy, while a guy's still in office. Time will tell. I think history will probably judge that he did a pretty good job of dealing with a very tough set of issues. If you recall, our economy in the United States had come very near to collapsing
Yes.
when he won the presidency. And he took some decisive steps to rectify that. Not everyone agrees with those steps, but nonetheless, he did take action. So he deserves some credit for that. I think, probably a mixed report card on the foreign policy side. For every notable success, whether it be, climate change agreements or indeed strengthening U.S. relations with ASEAN, there have been missteps, whether it's Libya or Syria or the Iran arms deal, which are subject to criticism. So, at the very least, he'll get a mixed report card with some positive things and some negative things. I personally felt honored to work at the White House for 2 years under his leadership. And that was because my portfolio, Southeast Asia, was a presidential priority. So
Absolutely.
I was very excited as a young guy working at the White House. And, it'll be interesting to see if any future president can match his level of interest and enthusiasm and willingness to engage in Southeast Asian issues. I sure hope so.
Well, we hope so as well. Let me ask you last question. I mean, we're watching the electoral votes coming in now, and as of 10:25 a.m., Trump leads with 128 electoral votes, 270 needed to win. I mean, what do these elections say about the American public, the deep division that we see now? What are Americans looking for? What is their view of the world?
Well, it's our country is politically split almost precisely at the 50-50 mark. And there are those who share a more progressive outlook on the role of government in ensuring more equitable economic outcomes and things like that. And those are generally Democrats and liberals. There are others who simply want the role of government to be minimized, to do the bare minimum and take the bare minimum of taxes. And they represent kind of the conservative viewpoint, and they're about 50% of the population. So it's really a knife edge, razor sharp difference. And you'll see that, even if President Clinton prevails tonight, it'll probably be by a fairly thin margin, particularly in the popular vote.
Yes.
And or if Trump wins, for that matter, by a similarly narrow margin. What that means going forward is certainly that one couldn't claim the mandate that President Duterte did after his resounding victory this summer in the Philippines.
Right.
He clearly could stand on the steps of the palace and say, I have a clear mandate and I'm going to pursue my policies. In the United States, there'll be no clear mandate like that. And I'm afraid that, divided, rancorous, contentious politics will be the order of the day for the foreseeable future.
Fantastic. Thank you, Desmond. We've been speaking with Desmond Walton. He is a former Southeast Asian National Security Advisor for the White House from 2009 to 2011. He's now the Senior Director for Southeast Asia Defense and Security for the Bauer Group Asia. Des, it's been really good to speak with you. I hope to catch up with you again soon.
Thank you, Maria.
Thanks so much.